Hi guys, welcome back to Fragments of a Simple Life, where every video I make is super simple. And happy Halloween to all of you who celebrate. Today, I thought I would make a different kind of video where you don't see too much of me or my hands. You just have a little bit of Halloween decor ambiance while I read you some stories. I will be reading from 3 books from a series called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Each story is a different feel, different theme, some kind of funny or corny, and some scary. If you're into that sort of thing. These books were written in 1981, 1984, and 1991. So the first book is even older than I am. And I'll be reading approximately 3 stories from each book. So please relax, enjoy as I read you scary stories to tell in the dark. The first book that we'll be reading is the first book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz, drawings by Stephen Gamble. The first story that we'll be reading together is called Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people have ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly. Please don't be offended by the word usage. And he agreed to take him. His name was Defago. They made camp in a snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap, but what he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air. The trees were standing perfectly still, yet he could hear the wind howling. And the more he listened, the more it sounded as if it was calling Defago's name. Defago, it called. Defago. I must be losing my mind, the hunter said. But Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. What's this all about? The hunter asked. It's nothing, Defago said. But the wind continued to call him, and Defago became more tense and more restless. Defago, it called. Defago. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet and began to run from the tent, but the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. You can't leave me out here, the hunter shouted. The wind called again, and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire." Then his voice faded away, and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods, down towards the lake, then out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long no human being could have taken them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first, he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought of something had pulled him onto the ice from the sky, but that made no sense. He stood there wondering what happened. The wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as if the night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from up above, and again he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet!" But there's nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago and he started out. Weeks later, he reached civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what happened to Defago that night. They had not seen him since then. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away. And more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky and it drops you. But it's just a crazy story." A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in, and he sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and asked, "Are you Defago?" The Indian man did not answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the man's hat. Then he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. Next story, called The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but the announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing. In its place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "That prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we really should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock," said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald. "He's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How would he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through the window and open a door," she said. "I'm scared. I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard someone or something scratch her door. "Did you hear that?" he asked, as they roared away. "It sounded like somebody was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a hook. Next story. High beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior in high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away and used to drive her car back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game, and now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck following her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. I guess we're going in the same direction, she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed a car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually, she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way. But when she turned onto the road, so did the truck. I've got to get him away from me, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on again, and then off again. She drove even faster, but the truck stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing? She wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later, he had them on again, and he left them on. At last she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. "Call the police!" she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. "You don't want me. You want him," he said. Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left school. He saw it happen, but there's no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was afraid to leave her, so he just followed her. And each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. I will now be reading from the second book, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz, drawings by Stephen Gamble again. The Window. Margaret and her brothers Paul and David shared a small house on top of a hill just outside the village. It was so warm one summer's night that Margaret could not sleep. She sat up in bed in the darkness of her room watching the moon move across the sky, and suddenly something caught her eye. She saw two small yellow-green lights moving through the woods near the graveyard at the bottom of the hill. They looked like the eyes of some animal, but she could not make out what kind of creature it was. Soon the creature left the woods and moved up the hill towards the house. For a few minutes, Margaret lost sight of it. Then she saw it coming across the lawn towards her window. It looked something like a man, and yet it didn't. Margaret was terrified. She wanted to run from her room, but the door was next to her window. She was afraid the creature would see her and break in before she could escape. When the creature turned and moved in the other direction, Margaret rushed to the door. But before she could open the door, it was back. Margaret found herself staring through the window at a shrunken face like that of a mummy. Its yellow-green eyes gleamed like a cat's eyes. She wanted to scream, but she was so frightened she couldn't make a sound. The creature broke the window glass, unlocked the window, and crawled inside. Margaret tried to flee, but the creature caught her. It twisted its long, bony fingers into her hair, pulled back her head, and sank its teeth into her throat. Margaret screamed and fainted. When her brothers heard her piercing scream, they rushed into her room, but by the time they got the door unlocked, the creature had fled. Margaret lay on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. While Paul tried to stop the bleeding, David chased down the creature, down the hill towards the graveyard, but soon he lost sight of it. The police thought it was the work of an escaped lunatic who believed he was a vampire. When Margaret recovered, her brothers wanted to move her to a safer place where it would be hard to break in, but Margaret refused. The creature would never come back. She was sure of that. But just in case, Paul and David began to keep loaded pistols in their rooms. One night, months later, Margaret was awakened by a scratching sound at the window. When she opened her eyes, it was the same shrunken face staring right at her. That night, her brothers heard her cries in time. They chased the creature down the hill and David shot it in the leg. But the creature managed to scramble over the graveyard wall and disappeared near an old burial vault. The next day, Margaret and her brothers watched as the sexton of the church opened the burial vault. Inside was a horrifying scene. Broken coffins, bones, and rotting flesh were scattered all over the floor. Only one coffin had not been disturbed. When the sexton opened it, there lay a creature with a shrunken face that had attacked Margaret. The telltale bullet was still in its leg. The only thing they knew was to get rid of themselves of a vampire. The sexton built a roaring blaze outside the vault and fed the shrunken body to the flames. They watched the body burn until nothing remained but ashes. Next story. The Dead Man's Hand. The students at the school for nurses got along quite well with one another, except for Alice. The trouble with Alice is that she was perfect. At least, that's how it seemed to the other students. She was always friendly and always cheerful. Nothing ever upset her. Her school assignments were always on time and always perfect. She didn't even bite her fingernails. Many of the student nurses resented Alice. They thought they would like to see her fail at something, become frightened or cry or do something that shows she had weaknesses like they did. One night, several students tried to frighten Alice with a practical joke. They borrowed a hand from a corpse they had been studying in anatomy and tied it to the light cord in her closet. When she tried to turn on the light, she would find herself holding a dead man's hand. That would scare anybody, one of them said. If it doesn't scare her, nothing will. After tying the hand in place, they went to the movies, and when they got back, Alice was asleep. But when they didn't see her the next morning, they decided to find out what happened. There's no sign of Alice in her room, but they soon found her. She was sitting on the floor in her closet, staring at the dead man's hand and mumbling to herself. Alice didn't even look up. The joke, it worked, but nobody was laughing. Next story. Cemetery Soup. On her way home from the market, the woman took a shortcut through the cemetery. There, sticking up out of the ground, she saw a big bone. She picked it up and looked it over carefully. "This will make a very good soup bone," she said. "I think I'll take it home. It's perfect weather for hot soup." When she got home, the first thing she did was start the soup. In a big soup pot went water, carrots, green beans, corn, barley, onions, potatoes, a snitch of beef, salt and pepper, and the bone. She brought it to a boil, then brought it down to a simmer. "Yum," she said, sniffing it and tasting it. "I can hardly wait till supper." Suddenly, she heard a small voice. "Please, give me back my bone." The woman paid no attention. Soon she heard the voice again. May I have my bone, please? The woman was reading the newspaper, and again she didn't take any notice. In a little while, the voice spoke up once more. It was beginning to sound angry. Give me back my bone. The woman kept on reading the paper. Some people are too impatient, she muttered. Once more the voice spoke, and it sounded very angry, so loud that the whole house shook. I want my bone back. The woman reached into the pot, grabbed the bone, and threw it out the window. In a voice just as loud, she shouted, Take it! There was an eerie silence. Then the woman heard footsteps scurrying away from the house down the road towards the ceremony. Then she got up and she served herself some soup. For our final 3 stories, we'll be reading from the 3rd book, Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones, by the same people. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the 2 men tended their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. Let's make a doll the size of a man, he said. It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds. It should look like Harold, Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw, and they gave it a pointy nose like Harold and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to the pool in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so they wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, How are the vegetables growing today, Harold? Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, Very slowly. And they would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, when they both were sick of it, and smear it on the doll's face. How do you like that stew, Harold? Well, you'd better eat it or else. Then the 2 men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. Did you hear that? Alfred asked. It was Harold, Thomas said. I was watching when it happened. I can't believe it. How could he grunt? Alfred said. He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible. Let's throw him in the fire, said Thomas, and that will be that. Let's not do anything stupid, said Alfred. We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him. So they left Harold sitting in the corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside of Harold, and they were making the sound. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. And one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. Harold's growing, he said. I was thinking the same thing, Thomas said. Maybe it's just our imagination, Alfred replied. We have been up here in the mountains for too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof, trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long, he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in the far corner of the pasture, and the men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day, and when they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing, but when they had been gone only 1 mile or two, they realized they'd forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one of them wanted to go back for them. But the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. After all, what could a doll do? They drew straws to see which one would go back, and it was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He didn't see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. Next story. Such things happen. When Bill Nelson's cow stopped giving milk, he called the veterinarian. "There's nothing wrong with that cow," the vet said. "She's just stubborn. That or some witch got hold of her." Bill and the vet both laughed. "That old hag, Addie Hitch. I guess she's the closest we've got to a witch around here," the vet said. "But witches have gone out of style, haven't they?" Bill had a run-in with Addie Fitch the month before. He had hit her cat with his car and killed it. "I'm really sorry, Addie Fitch," he told her. "I'll get you a new cat, just as pretty, just as good." Her eyes filled with hate. "I raised that cat from a kitten," she hissed. "I loved her. You'll be sorry for this, Bill Nelson." Bill sent her a new cat and heard nothing more. Then his cow stopped giving milk. Next, his old truck broke down. After that, his wife fell and broke her arm. "We're having a lot of bad luck," he thought. Then he thought, maybe it is Addie Fitch getting even. And then, "Hey, you don't believe in witches. You're just upset." But Bill's grandpa believed in witches. He had once told Bill that there's only one sure way to stop a witch from causing trouble. "You find a black walnut tree," he said. "You draw her picture on it. Then you mark an X where her heart is, and you drive a nail into the X. Every day you drive it in a little deeper. If she's causing the trouble," he said, "she'll feel the pain. When she can't stand it anymore, she'll come to you or send somebody or try to borrow something. If you give her what she wants, it breaks the power of the nail, and she'll go on tormenting you. But if you don't, she'll have to stop, or the pain will kill her." That's what his nice and gentle old grandpa actually believed. It's pure craziness, Bill thought. Of course, his grandpa didn't have much schooling. Bill went to college. He knew better. Then Bill's dog, Joe, a perfectly healthy dog, dropped dead. Just like that. It made Bill angry. Despite all of his schooling, he thought maybe it is Addie Fitch after all. He got a red crayon from his son's room and a hammer and a nail, and he went to the woods. He found a black walnut tree and drew a picture of Addie Fitch on it. He made an X where her heart was, like his grandpa had said to do. With a hammer, he drove a nail a little way into the X, and then he went home. "I feel like a fool," he told his wife. "You should," she said. The next day, a boy named Timmy Logan came by. "Addie Fitch isn't feeling well," he said. "She wondered if she could borrow some sugar from you." Bill Nelson stared at Timmy in amazement. He took a deep breath. "Tell her I'm sorry, but I don't have any sugar right now," he said. When Timmy Logan left, Bill went back to the walnut tree and he drove the nail in another inch, and the next day the boy came back. "Addie Fitch is pretty sick. She's wondering if you've got any sugar yet." "Tell her I'm sorry," Bill Nelson said, "but I still don't have any." Bill went out into the woods and drove the nail in another inch, and the following day the boy came back. "Addie Fitch is getting sicker. She really needs some sugar." "Tell her I still don't have any," Bill answered. Bill's wife was angry. "You've got to stop this," she said. "If this mumbo jumbo works, it's like murder." "I'll stop when she does," he said. Towards dusk, he stood in the yard staring at the ridge where the old lady lived, wondering what was going on up there. Then, in the half-darkness, she saw Addie Fitch coming slowly down the hill towards him. With her pitched, bony face and her old black coat, she looked like a witch. As she got closer, Bill saw what she could barely walk. "Maybe I really am hurting her," he thought. He ran to get his hammer to pull the nail out, but before he could leave, Addie Fitch was in the yard, her face twisted with rage. "First you killed my cat," she said. "Then you wouldn't give me a bit of sugar when I needed it." She swore at him and fell dead at his feet. "I'm not surprised that she dropped dead that way," the doctor said later. "She was very old, maybe 90. It was her heart, of course." "Some people thought she was a witch," Bill said. "I've heard that," the doctor said. "Somebody thought Addie Fitch had witched him," Bill went on. "He drew a picture of her on a tree and then drove a nail into it to make her stop." "That's an old superstition," the doctor said. "But people like us don't believe in that sort of thing. Do we?" The last story. The Dream. Lucy Morgan was an artist. She spent a week painting in a small country town and decided that the next day she would move on. She would go to a village called Kingston. But that night Lucy Morgan had a strange dream. She dreamed that she was walking up a dark carved staircase and entering a bedroom. It was an ordinary room except for two things. The carpet was made of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lucy Morgan went to sleep in that bedroom. During the night, a woman with a pale face and black eyes and long black hair came into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Flee while you can." When the woman touched her arm to hurry her along, Lucy Morgan awakened from her dream with a shriek. She lay awake for the rest of the night, trembling. In the morning, she told her landlady that she decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just cannot bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady said. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So Lucy Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was as nice as she could be. "Let's look at the room," she said. "I think you'll like it." They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lucy's dream. These old houses, the staircases are all the same, Lucy thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors and the same windows fastened with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lucy told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady asked. Not sure," she said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring up some tea while you think about it." Lucy sat on the bed staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with the pale face and the black eyes and the long black hair. Lucy Morgan grabbed her things. and fled. Thank you guys for listening to the scary stories. I really hope you appreciated and enjoyed these books that bring back a lot of memories from my childhood, with the first one being written before I was ever even born. I hope you all have a wonderful and safe and happy Halloween. Eat all of your children's candy if you have kids, and have a fun time. I will see you guys later. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Bye.